an open letter to the Egyptian government and the Egyptian people. Black lives matter no less than Arab lives. Here I stand again, compelled to publish yet another open letter on behalf of the people of Ethiopia. I come again with this increasingly urgent message and at this most critical and pertinent time. The entire world has been rudely awakened to the nightmarish reality that black people in America and the world over are still living. Many have finally started listening to their conscience, opening their eyes to the ongoing racism around them, and I commend those that are wholeheartedly trying to address past and present injustice. And yet, Egypt, you have the audacity to deny 300 million black Africans in 11 Nile Basin countries the use of their own ancestral waters, which they have been drinking for thousands of years. You have the callousness and blatant racism to insist that 65 million Ethiopians live in darkness, total darkness, as they remain without electric supply, even though Ethiopia is the source of 85% of the Nile waters. All this while you bask in light and prosperity, using the very rivers that genesis in our own homeland. You not only take the lion's share, 85% of the Nile waters, 15% going to the Sudan, but you dare deny Ethiopia and 300 million black Africans the use of even 5% of the Nile waters. This is an insult, an assault on the humanity of all black people in the world. Your behavior can only be characterized as one driven by compulsive destruction and greed, devoid of the slightest sense of conscience, restraint, or common decency. Simply put, all Africans, black people around the world, indeed, all justice-focused citizens of the world can see that your behavior is guided by a broken moral compass, one that operates by a magnetic field dating back to your days as brokers of the East African slave trade era. To add insult to injury, you still shamelessly cite your justification a unilateral treaty with your former colonial master, the Queen of England, who gave you veto power and 90% of the Nile waters to do with as you please. It is incomprehensible that you bring this as a defense, something even a child knows makes no sense. Well, it's 2020 and former colonial powers no longer call the shots. You can't lean on your puppet masters now, not when the matter concerns Ethiopia and 11 Nile Basin countries. I trust you, the Egyptian government and Egyptian people, have heard the apparently radical notion that's gaining momentum in the West today, that Black Lives Matter. Does it ring true to you, Egypt? Do the lives of 300 million black Africans living in 11 Nile Basin countries matter to you? Do the lives of 65 million Ethiopians who live in total darkness in the 21st century matter to you? Do Black lives matter to the Egyptian people? I ask again, are you willing and able to right this historical wrong? Are you capable of fixing the birth defect of your nation? Or has your moral compass, your collective conscience, been irreversibly damaged by your diabolical past, the scar tissue that resulted from your days as the captains of the East African slave trade ships that violently yanked tens of millions of African men and women from their beloved Africa and hauled them like cattle to their grave across the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. Egypt, so that you understand. When the world cries, Black Lives Matter, we don't mean only in Minnesota and Atlanta. Black Lives Matter in Africa too. When we say Black Lives Matter, we are not only talking in comparison with white people, but that Black Lives Matter no less than Arab lives. When we say Black Lives Matter, we also mean that Arabs, the Arab League, cannot band together to keep 65 million Black Africans in the dark. When we say Black Lives Matter, we're dumping the 1929 and 1959 treaty by the order of the Queen of England into the rubbish bin of history. Such agreements have no place in the post-colonial world, where our countries have the freedom to stand on their own 2 feet and make our own treaty on our own terms. The dam, having now been in the making for almost a decade, is completely financed by poor Ethiopian farmers whose daughters walk barefoot, scouring the earth in search of firewood. It is intended to provide a sustainable source of power to 65 million Ethiopians. Unfortunately, each day, its imminent and long-awaited completion receives an increasingly theatrical response from Egypt. And most worryingly of all, Egypt's threat of war as a misplaced retaliation to Ethiopia's attempt to independently provide its people with basic human rights has become even more foreboding. Ethiopia is known globally for suffering from cyclical drought and devastating famine year after year. In fact, for Ethiopians, famine is a constant threat, and around 8 million people rely on annual emergency humanitarian assistance, making it an issue of global concern and global benefit that we become self-reliant using the resources that we have as any country would. I would like to emphasize again that over 65 million Ethiopians have no electricity, meaning all women and children as young as 6 years old walk for an average of 3 hours a day to gather firewood. Tragically, Ethiopia has lost 98% of its forest land in the last 50 years due to lack of electricity. This again is devastating not only for the country, but for the entire global community, who is finally opening its eyes to the vital need to preserve our natural landscape to ensure that the world is still livable for our grandchildren.